Inspiring Muslim women in Islamic history. What if I told you that some of the most powerful leaders, educators, and pioneers in human history are people you may have never even heard of? And here's the twist. They weren't kings, they weren't generals, they were Muslim women. We live in a world where people often ask, can women really be leaders in Islam? But let me flip that question. How could Islam have survived, spread, and thrived without women? Because every time you pull back the curtain of history, you find a woman standing tall, often unnoticed, yet absolutely unstoppable. Khadijah, or the first supporter of Islam, a successful businesswoman who invested in the Prophet's mission. Aisha, a leading scholar whose knowledge shaped Islamic thought for centuries. Fatimah, al-Fihri, founder of the world's oldest university, proving women's leadership in education. Musa, a fearless warrior who defended the Prophet on the battlefield. Muslim women have always been pioneers, leaders, and trailblazers, despite being overlooked. Their legacy is a call for us today to rise, to lead, and to continue their mission of courage, knowledge, and vision. Imagine stepping into the bustling marketplace of Makkah more than 1400 years ago. The air is filled with the cries of merchants calling out their goods, the scent of spices traveling from caravans that came all the way from Yemen and Syria, the sight of rich fabrics, jewels, and leather piled high on stalls. In this world of trade, wealth was power, and reputation meant everything. And standing above them all was a woman who commanded respect in a society where women were often silenced. Her name was Khadijah bint Khuwaylid. But to call her simply a businesswoman would be like calling the ocean just a pond. She was the tide that moved the entire marketplace. She was known as al-Tahira, the Pure One, a title not given lightly in a city where corruption, deceit, and exploitation were common in business. She built her empire not by chance but by strategy. Her caravans were said to outnumber all the others combined. Imagine that when the Quraysh sent out a trade journey, her camels, her goods, her investments dominated the horizon. Men negotiated in her name. Traders partnered under her contracts. She was, in every sense of the word, a powerhouse. And yet, despite her position, she wasn't arrogant. She carried herself with dignity, with calmness, with trust that made people want to work with her. Now picture this, in that same marketplace, there was a young man, honest, known to never lie, to never cheat. People called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy. That man was Muhammad, not yet a prophet, not yet the messenger of Allah, but simply a man with integrity so radiant it couldn't be ignored. Khadijah heard of his reputation. She didn't need to, but she took a risk, a calculated one. She entrusted him with her wealth, sending him on a trade expedition with her servant Maysara. What she saw in return would change not just her life, but the course of history itself. When Muhammad returned, not only had the business prospered beyond expectation, but Maysara reported back details that shook Khadijah's heart. He spoke of how Muhammad conducted himself with honesty, how he treated others with kindness, how he refused to cheat even when he could have, how his character was unlike anything the marketplace had ever witnessed. Khadijah was not just impressed with Prophet, she was moved by his integrity. Think about that. In a world where wealth was everything, she valued character more than gold. This is where the story takes a turn, because Khadijah, the woman who could have married any man in Quraysh, chose Muhammad. And it wasn't a shallow choice. It was the choice of a woman who saw potential where others saw nothing. It was the choice of a woman who recognized greatness before the world knew his name. Sometimes the most powerful act is not climbing to the top yourself, but seeing someone else's climb before they even begin. Years later, when the first revelation descended upon Muhammad in the cave of Hira, he rushed down trembling, shaken to his core, fearing for his life, his sanity, his very being. And where did he go? Straight into the arms of Khadijah. In that moment, when the future of Islam was nothing but a fragile spark, Khadijah became the shield that protected it. She wrapped him in comfort, She soothed his heart, and with words that carried the weight of mountains, she said, "Be Allah. Allah will never disgrace you. You uphold family ties, you bear the burdens of the weak, you help the poor and needy, you honor guests, and you assist in times of truth." Pause there. Reflect on the magnitude of this moment. The very first testimony of belief in the Prophet's mission didn't come from a crowd, a scholar, or a leader. It came from a woman, from his wife, from Khadijah. She believed when no one else dared. She gave her heart, her wealth, her reputation, her safety. She stood between him and the world when the world turned hostile. Picture her in the years that followed. The Quraysh began to boycott the Muslims, starving them, isolating them in the valley of Abu Talib. Families were eating leaves to survive. And who was pouring her wealth, her resources, everything she had into keeping them alive? Khadijah. Imagine her selling her jewelry, her possessions, bit by bit, to buy food when others were too afraid to trade with Muslims. Imagine the sleepless nights, the hunger gnawing at her stomach, but the unwavering light in her eyes as she encouraged the Prophet to keep going. That is not just love. That is sacrifice on a level most of us cannot even fathom. Think about how often we measure success today. We look at bank accounts, followers, promotions, status. Yet here was Khadijah, the wealthiest woman in Mecca, willingly giving up every coin, every comfort, to invest in something invisible to the world, the future of faith. She saw beyond profit margins. She invested in purpose. And her investment is still paying dividends today. Every time someone utters the words La ilaha illa Allah, even the Prophet never forgot. Years after her death, he would mention Khadijah with tears in his eyes. He would send gifts to her friends. He would speak of her as though she was still in the room. Once, when Aisha asked him if Khadijah was really that special, he responded, "She believed in me when people disbelieved. She affirmed me when people denied me. She supported me with her wealth when people deprived me. And Allah blessed me with children through her and not through any other woman." Those words carry eternity within them. Now, let me bring this closer to our lives. How many of us are searching for someone to believe in us when the world doesn't? How many of us crave a Khadijah in our lives? A voice that says, "I see your worth even if no one else does." And how many of us are willing to be that Khadijah for someone else? Because here's the truth, greatness rarely rises alone. Behind every person who changes the world is someone who whispered, "Don't give up, I believe in you." Imagine if Khadijah hadn't been there. Imagine if fear had overtaken her, if she had told Muhammad to walk away, to stop, to stay silent. Would the mission have survived? We don't know. But we do know that Allah chose her for that role, and through her strength, the foundation of Islam was laid. And that is the hidden secret. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is not leading armies or building monuments, but simply believing in the right person at the right time. So, when we look at Khadijah's life, don't just see a story in a history book. See a mirror. See a reminder that your belief in someone might be the very thing that changes their destiny. See that success is not just measured in what you achieve, but in what you empower others to achieve. See that true wealth isn't in what you keep, but in what you give for a purpose greater than yourself. And above all, see the truth that the story of Islam didn't begin with war or conquest or power. It began with the heart of a woman, her courage, her trust, her sacrifice. Khadijah wasn't just the first Muslim. She was the first investor in faith. And sometimes, that is the kind of legacy that outlives empires. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine walking into a gathering in Medina over 1,000 years ago. The room is filled with eager faces, young and old, men who have traveled across deserts and seas, scholars carrying scrolls, students with hearts burning to learn. The atmosphere is electric, almost like the hum of energy before a great performance begins. And at the center of this circle of knowledge is not an elderly man with a long beard, not a famous warrior, not a political leader. It is a woman. Her voice is calm yet commanding. her memory flawless, her reasoning sharp, her words so clear that every listener leans forward, afraid to miss even a syllable. This woman is Aisha bint Abu Bakr, wife of the Prophet Muhammad and one of the greatest scholars in Islamic history. It is easy to underestimate the scale of her influence until you realize this. Without Aisha, our understanding of the Prophet's life, his teachings, and the practice of Islam itself would be incomplete. She was not just a wife who shared his home, she was a living archive of revelation, a guardian of knowledge, and a teacher to nations. Imagine being married to the Prophet at such a young age, growing up in the very household where revelation descended, observing the private life of the Messenger of Allah, the way he prayed at night, the way he laughed, the way he carried himself at home. She absorbed everything. And later, when companions and scholars wanted to know how the Prophet really lived, how he applied the Qur'an in daily life, it was Aisha they turned to. She narrated more than 2,000 hadith. But beyond numbers, what made her extraordinary was her precision. She didn't just memorize words, she captured context. She corrected misunderstandings. She provided details others overlooked. For instance, when a companion once narrated that the Prophet used to see Allah in a dream, Aisha responded firmly, quoting the Qur'an itself to clarify that what the Prophet saw was the angel Jibril, not Allah directly. Her knowledge wasn't passive, it was active, critical, alive. She engaged with scholars, debated with men twice her age, and stood her ground with confidence that could only come from certainty. Think of what it means to have that kind of courage. Imagine being a woman in 7th century Arabia, in a culture where women were often silenced, yet raising your voice to correct men in public, not for ego, but for truth. Aisha did it again and again, not out of rebellion, but out of devotion to preserving the message. She wasn't just answering questions, she was shaping theology, law, and history. She was, in effect, a walking encyclopedia of Islam. Her students included some of the greatest scholars the world has ever known. Men like Urwa ibn Zubair, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, and many others traveled to her doorstep for answers. Abu Musa himself once said, "Whenever we companions of the Prophet faced any difficulty in understanding a hadith, we went to Aisha and found that she had knowledge of it." Can you see the magnitude of that? She was the go-to authority in a community filled with senior male companions. That means her knowledge was not just respected, it was indispensable. Now picture this in our modern context. Imagine a woman whose wisdom is so sought after that heads of state, professors, and community leaders all line up at her door to learn. That was Aisha. She wasn't just a teacher in a room, her influence rippled across generations. And the beauty is she didn't only focus on religious rulings. She also transmitted stories of tenderness, humor, and humanity. Through her, we know how the Prophet joked with his family, how he raised her in playfulness, how he showed mercy even in small details. Without Aisha, Islam might have been seen only as rules and laws, but through her lens, it became a faith of love, compassion, and intimacy. She also showed remarkable strength in times of trial. During the incident of slander, when false rumors were spread about her character, she endured pain that could have shattered anyone. Imagine the weight of being accused, whispered about, judged by your own community. Yet she remained patient until revelation came to clear her name in the Qur'an itself. That moment was not just a vindication of Aisha. It was a lesson for all of humanity that dignity and truth are protected by Allah, even when the world doubts you. Think about how relatable that is today. Haven't you ever faced moments when people misunderstood you, when your name was dragged unfairly, when you felt isolated? Aisha's story is proof that truth has a way of surfacing, even if the weight feels unbearable. Her patience was not passive. It was dignified, rooted in trust. That is a strength we can all draw from in our lives. And what about her role in matters of law and governance? Aisha wasn't just teaching hadith. She was giving verdicts, issuing legal opinions, influencing the very structure of Islamic law. Her grasp of medicine, poetry, and genealogy was unmatched. She was what we might call today an interdisciplinary scholar, a mind that refused to be boxed in. She could quote verses, analyze principles, and at the same time give advice on practical health remedies. She bridged the spiritual and the practical in a way that made her wisdom timeless. Imagine if Aisha lived today. She'd be the keynote speaker at international conferences, the best-selling author whose books line every shelf, the professor whose lectures fill stadiums, the consultant governments seek for guidance. And yet, even with all that brilliance, she carried humility. Her goal was never fame, it was service. Service to the message, service to truth, service to the Ummah. What makes her even more inspiring is her youth. Often we think greatness is reserved for old age, for people who've lived long lives and gained experience. But Aisha's impact shows us that age is not a barrier to wisdom or influence. She was young, yet she guided the old. She was female, yet she instructed men. She was living in a patriarchal society, yet her voice could not be suppressed. Doesn't that challenge so many of the limitations we place on ourselves today? How often do we think, I'm too young, too inexperienced, too small to make a difference? Aisha's life dismantles all those excuses. She also had a fiery personality. She wasn't afraid to express emotion, to argue passionately, to stand firm. And that's important because it reminds us that piety in Islam doesn't mean erasing your personality. She was real. She laughed, she competed, she debated. She was authentic in every sense. And yet, all of that was channeled towards something greater. Perhaps the most touching part of her legacy is how much the Prophet loved her. His affection for her was open, unapologetic, and enduring. When he was asked who he loved most, he answered immediately, Aisha. That love itself was a lesson for the Ummah, that honoring women, valuing them, learning from them, is not a threat to faith, but a reflection of it. And when the Prophet passed away, where was he? Resting in Aisha's arms, in her home, buried in the very place where she prayed. Her story is woven into the very final moments of the Prophet's life, making her not just a witness to revelation, but a guardian of its completion. So when we remember Aisha, don't just see a young woman in history. See the image of someone who refused to be silent, who turned knowledge into power, who carried truth with courage. See her as the embodiment of possibility. That your voice matters, that your understanding can shape generations, that your courage can outlive your years. Because Aisha didn't just preserve Islam, she made sure it was lived, breathed, and loved. And that is why her name still echoes through time like a bell that refuses to stop ringing. Picture a quiet courtyard in the heart of Fez, Morocco, more than 1,000 years ago. The sun is rising over tiled rooftops, its golden light spilling across narrow alleys filled with traders, travelers, and scholars. Caravans bring goods from Africa, manuscripts from Andalusia, and stories from every corner of the Muslim world. And in this city, at a time when women were often expected to remain invisible, one woman was quietly shaping the destiny of education for the entire globe. Her name was Fatimah al-Fihri. She was not a queen, not a warrior, not someone who led armies, but what she built has outlived kings, dynasties, and empires. She was the founder of the University of al-Qarawiyyin, the oldest continually operating university in the world, still standing today, recognized by UNESCO and the Guinness World Records. Imagine that a Muslim woman planted the seed of higher learning centuries before Oxford, before Cambridge, before Harvard. But let's go back to the beginning, because Fatimah's story is not simply about an institution. It's about vision. She was born into a family of wealth, originally from Tunisia. Her father was a successful merchant who had moved the family to Fez, one of the great cultural centers of the Islamic world. When her father passed away, Fatimah and her sister Maryam inherited significant wealth. Now, here's where the story takes a twist. Many people, in that moment, would have simply protected their inheritance, secured their future, built mansions, or increased their trade. But Fatimah thought differently. She saw wealth as a trust, not just a possession. She saw money as a tool for building something that would outlast her. She decided to dedicate her inheritance to establishing a place of worship and learning. Not just a mosque where people prayed, but a place where hearts and minds could grow together. Imagine her walking through the crowded streets of Fez, choosing the land, overseeing the construction, making sure every detail was perfect. This wasn't just a donation, it was a labor of love. It is said she even fasted throughout much of the building process, dedicating herself spiritually to the project as though it were an act of worship in itself. She wasn't just building walls, she was building an idea, a dream that knowledge should be accessible, structured, and preserved for generations. The Qarawiyyin started as a mosque, but quickly became a center of learning. And here's the astonishing part. It became the template for what we now call the modern university. It had organized classes, structured curricula, degrees that recognized levels of mastery. From its halls came scholars who shaped not only Islamic civilization, but also influenced Europe during its Renaissance. Think about that. When Europe was struggling through the Dark Ages, knowledge from Qarawiyyin was flowing through Andalusia into Spain, igniting sparks that would eventually fuel the rebirth of science, philosophy, and art in the West. And at the root of that intellectual chain reaction was the vision of a Muslim woman, Fatimah al-Fihri. Now imagine the students who once sat under the arches of that university. The great Ibn Khaldun, often called the father of sociology and historiography, the brilliant Ibn al-Arabi, whose works on mysticism still inspire thinkers today. Even Jewish philosopher Maimonides is believed to have been influenced by the environment of knowledge that flourished in Morocco. These names, etched into history, trace back to a woman's decision to invest her wealth into learning. Can you see the ripple effect? Fatima may never have met them personally, but her legacy gave them space to thrive. Her vision was like planting a tree under whose shade countless generations would sit. Think about the contrast with our world today. So many people are obsessed with quick success, instant results, achievements they can measure in weeks, maybe years. But Fatima thought in centuries. She made a choice whose fruits she would never fully taste in her lifetime. That kind of vision requires faith, patience, and a heart that isn't tied to immediate reward. Imagine if more of us lived like that. If we invested in things that would outlast us. If we built with the future in mind, not just the present. Fatima's story also challenges the stereotypes that people often have about women in Islam. How often do we hear that women were denied leadership, that they were hidden away, that they had no voice? Yet here was a woman who not only had a voice, but used it to create one of the most enduring educational institutions in the world. She didn't wait for permission to dream. She didn't ask if society would accept her contribution. She simply gave, and her giving changed history. Her legacy is a direct contradiction to the narrative that Muslim women were passive observers. She proves that they were architects of civilization itself. Now picture this centuries later. When young students walk into al-Qarawiyyin today, they enter through doors that still carry the memory of Fatima's vision. They sit in classrooms where the Qur'an was recited, where astronomy was studied, where medicine was debated, where philosophy and jurisprudence were sharpened like blades. And though the world has changed, empires have risen and fallen, borders have been redrawn, the pulse of knowledge still beats within those walls, and every beat whispers her name. There is also something profoundly symbolic about her choice to build a university through her inheritance. In many societies, inheritance divides families, tears siblings apart, breeds greed. But Fatima turned it into unity, service, and growth. It reminds us that wealth itself is not the problem. It's what you do with it that matters. Fatima transformed her material wealth into spiritual and intellectual wealth for humanity. She saw her fortune not as a ladder to climb above others, but as a foundation upon which others could stand. Her story is also deeply personal if you let it be. Ask yourself, What am I building that will outlive me? It may not be a university. It may not be something on a global scale. But it could be as simple as the knowledge you pass to your children, the charity you give quietly, the small project you start in your community. Fatimah teaches us that legacy isn't about size, it's about intention. What you build with sincerity has the power to echo through centuries. And think about how her vision connects to us today, in an age where education is still a privilege denied to millions of girls around the world. Fatimah's story stands as a powerful reminder that women have always been at the forefront of education in Islam. She didn't just create a space for men to learn, she created a space for all knowledge seekers. She carved a place in history where the love of learning became an act of devotion, where seeking knowledge was seen as worship. What's remarkable is how quiet her story is compared to her impact. Most people know the names of conquerors, kings, and dynasties, yet their empires have crumbled. But how many know the name of Fatimah al-Fihri, whose contribution still lives? That is the irony of history. Sometimes the ones who shout the loudest leave the faintest marks, and the ones who move quietly create legacies that endure forever. So when we think of Fatimah, imagine her not as a distant historical figure, but as a reminder standing right in front of us. A reminder that you don't need an army to change the world. You don't need a throne. You don't even need recognition. You just need vision, sincerity, and the courage to give. Because sometimes one act of giving can become the foundation upon which entire civilizations rise. And maybe that's the true power of Fatimah al-Fihri. She showed us that legacy isn't written in the loud moments of history, but in the quiet decisions made with faith. And those decisions, like her university, can stand tall for 1,000 years and still whisper hope into the ears of generations not yet born. The battlefield is alive with chaos. Dust fills the air, swords clash against shields, arrows whistle overhead. The sound of war is deafening, men shouting, horses charging, the ground trembling beneath the weight of combat. And in the middle of this storm, there is a figure that no one expected. Not a seasoned general, not a towering warrior, but a woman. Her name is Nusayba bint Ka'b, and she is holding a sword with a grip so steady it could split stone. Imagine the shock of those around her, because this was 7th century Arabia, where women were rarely even seen near a battlefield. Yet here she was, fighting side by side with the Prophet Muhammad, shielding him with her very body, her courage unshaken even as blades sliced through the air. It was the Battle of Uhud. The Quraysh had returned with a vengeance after their defeat at Badr. The Muslims were outnumbered, facing an army 3 times their size. At first, victory seemed within reach. But when some archers disobeyed the Prophet's command and abandoned their positions, the tide of battle turned. Chaos erupted, the Muslims scattered, and the Prophet A was suddenly vulnerable, exposed to attack from all sides. In that critical moment, when many fled in fear, Nusayba stepped forward. She positioned herself in front of the Prophet like a living shield. Every time an enemy raised his sword, she blocked it. Every time a spear was hurled, she absorbed the blow. The Prophet A later said, "Wherever I turned, to the right or to the left, I saw Nusayba fighting for me." Picture that image. The messenger of Allah, the final prophet, the most important man in history, surrounded by danger, and there, always within reach, was this woman, unflinching, fearless, fighting with everything she had. Her arms and shoulders bore deep wounds that day. Some narrations mention she suffered more than a dozen injuries, and yet she never retreated. When her sword broke, she grabbed a spear. When her spear was lost, she picked up another weapon from the ground. She fought until her body could hardly move, driven not by rage or glory, but by loyalty and love for the truth. What kind of heart does it take to step into that kind of danger? Most people's instinct is to run when death is near, but Nusayba's instinct was to stand taller. And maybe that's the secret. Real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to stand even while fear beats against your chest like a drum. She wasn't fearless. She was determined. There's a difference. And it's a difference we need to remember in our own lives. Now, imagine her perspective. She wasn't just fighting as a soldier. She was a mother. Her sons were on that battlefield too. At one point, the Prophet looked at her son and said, "Your wound needs tending." But Nusayba, wiping blood from her own face, urged her son, "Get up and fight again." Her love was not the soft kind that shields a child from difficulty, but the fierce kind that pushes them to rise higher than themselves. How many of us today, when tested, retreat into comfort? Yet Nusayba teaches us that true love sometimes demands sacrifice, sometimes demands letting go of safety so something greater can be defended. And her story doesn't end with Uhud. Years later, when false prophets arose after the death of Muhammad threatening to tear the Muslim community apart, Nusayba was there again. She fought against Musaylima the liar at the Battle of Yamama, an older woman by then, her body scarred but her spirit unbroken. It was there that she lost her son, Habib, who was brutally martyred. Imagine the grief of a mother watching her child killed in the ugliest way, tortured for refusing to renounce Islam. Yet instead of drowning in despair, she turned that pain into resolve. She carried her sword into battle, determined that her son's sacrifice would not be in vain. By the end of the battle, she had lost an arm, taken wounds across her body, but the false prophet was defeated, and her name was carved into history as a woman whose loyalty never wavered, no matter the cost. Think about what that means for us today. Most of us will never hold a sword, never step onto a battlefield of steel and blood, but we all face battles of a different kind, battles of faith, of dignity, of principles in a world that constantly pressures us to compromise. And the question is, when those moments come, will we scatter like the archers who left their posts, or will we stand like Nusayba, unshaken, even when the odds are stacked against us? Her courage is not just a story to admire, it's a mirror. How often do we hesitate to speak the truth because we fear criticism? How often do we stay silent when someone mocks our faith because we don't want to stand out? How often do we put our comfort above our convictions? Nusayba didn't hesitate, didn't wait for someone else to step forward. She made the choice herself. And that choice is what made her immortal. There's also something profoundly moving about how the Prophet honored her. After the battle, he prayed for her and her family, acknowledging her sacrifices with words that carried the weight of eternity. That recognition itself is a lesson that the Prophet saw value, honor, and greatness in women who stepped forward. He didn't silence her, didn't tell her to retreat, didn't minimize her role. He uplifted her. And in doing so, he set an example for all of us, that women are not bystanders in faith, they are warriors of it in every sense of the word. Imagine the kind of strength it took for her to keep going after every wound, after losing her son, after losing her arm. Most people would retreat, hide, live quietly. But Nusayba never chose quiet. She chose to live boldly, to fight boldly, to believe boldly. And maybe that's why her story still electrifies hearts today, because we all long to be that fearless, to be that committed, to know deep down that our lives stand for something greater than survival. Think of it this way: history remembers thousands of men who fought in those battles, but most of their names have faded into dust. Yet the name of Nusayba bint Kayab still shines like a torch in the dark. Why? Because she wasn't just another fighter. She was the one who stepped into the impossible and made it possible. She showed the world that courage has no gender, that loyalty has no limit, that faith is worth bleeding for. So when you hear her story, don't just imagine a woman with a sword on a battlefield long ago. Imagine yourself standing at the crossroads of your own struggles, asked to choose between comfort and conviction, between safety and sacrifice. Imagine her standing beside you, whispering, "Don't run. Stand firm. Be unshakable," because that is her legacy, not just wounds and battles, but a spirit that still calls us to rise higher than fear, higher than doubt, higher than the limits we place on ourselves. And perhaps that's why the image of her on the battlefield is so unforgettable. Amid the dust, the noise, the chaos, one figure keeps appearing wherever the Prophet turns. A woman, battered but unbroken. Her blade flashing in the sun, her heart a fortress of faith. That image is not just history. It is destiny. A reminder that every generation needs its Nusaybahs, and that maybe, just maybe, you are meant to be one of them. Lose your eyes and imagine history as a vast stage. On it, thousands of names flash across time: kings who built palaces, generals who led armies, philosophers who filled libraries, poets who painted the air with words. But here's the secret: if you look closely, behind almost every one of those men, you'll find someone whose name the world rarely repeats, someone whose influence runs deeper than the crown or the sword. That someone is often a woman. And in Islamic history, those women weren't background characters. They were the backbone, the heartbeat, the quiet architects who held entire civilizations together. Yet their names are often the ones left in the margins of books, their stories whispered instead of shouted. But when you uncover those whispers, you realize something astonishing. Muslim women have always been pioneers, leaders, trailblazers, even when the world refused to notice. Think about it. From the very beginning of Islam, women were not spectators, they were participants. Khadijah bint Khuwaylid didn't just support her husband Muhammad emotionally. She poured her wealth into the mission of Islam when it was nothing more than a fragile flame in a hostile desert. She could have kept her riches, lived comfortably, and stayed silent. Instead, she became the first investor in faith itself. That wasn't just a private act of loyalty. It was a public act of leadership, though the world didn't call it by that name. Without Khadijah's courage to risk her status and her fortune, the story of Islam might have unfolded very differently. Then comes Aisha, who didn't just inherit knowledge from living beside the Prophet She preserved it, transmitted it, and sharpened it with her own intellect. Imagine thousands of men traveling from distant lands just to sit in front of a woman, pen in hand, eager to hear her explanations. She wasn't simply repeating what she'd heard, she debated, corrected, expanded. She shaped the very framework of Islamic scholarship. Yet how often do we speak of her as one of the founding architects of religious education? She was a trailblazer, but her title was not written in stone the way it would have been had she been a man. And then there is Fatimah al-Fihri, a woman who decided that the wealth in her hands wasn't for silk garments or golden bracelets, but for building a university, the University of al-Qarawiyyin, that would outlast dynasties, outlive kings, and still stand today as the oldest continually running university in the world. She didn't march into battle or write poetry that echoed in the courts of kings. She simply made a decision, a vision larger than herself. She planted the seed of education for generations unborn. And yet, how many people walking through that university today know the name of the woman who built it? And then, of course, Nusaybah, whose story sounds almost like a legend because it's so shocking to the imagination. A woman stepping onto the battlefield, sword in hand, shielding the Prophet with her own body, suffering wounds that would have killed others, yet refusing to back down. Her courage was not symbolic, it was physical, visible, undeniable, and the Prophet himself honored her. But even with such praise, history books often brush past her name. She is not listed alongside the great generals or warriors, but her actions surpassed many of them. Do you see the pattern? These women were there, right at the heart of Islam's foundation and flourishing, but the world rarely calls them pioneers. And yet that's exactly what they were. A pioneer is someone who steps into uncharted territory, someone who goes where no one expects them to go, someone who leaves a trail so others can follow. That is exactly what these women did. The truth is, we often misunderstand leadership. We think of it as standing on a podium, giving orders, wearing a crown, or having people chant your name. But real leadership is influence. It's the ability to shape hearts, minds, and futures, even if no one builds a statue in your honor. By that definition, Muslim women have been some of the greatest leaders the world has ever seen. They may not have ruled empires, but they preserved knowledge, defended faith, and nurtured generations of believers. Their legacy is quieter, but no less powerful. Now let's bring this closer to us. Imagine yourself sitting in a classroom today, flipping through a textbook filled with names and dates. How often do you come across women's names? Rarely. But if you were to pull back the curtain, you'd realize those missing names are the ones who made sure the story kept moving forward. Isn't that the case in our own lives too? Think of your mother, your sister, your teacher. How often do they go unseen, unnoticed, while carrying the weight of everything? They are the hidden pioneers of our own stories, the ones who quietly shape us into who we are. There's a reason the Prophet said, "The best of you are those who are best to their women." He understood what so many still fail to see, that the strength of a community rests on the shoulders of its women. When women are honored, empowered, and given space, societies rise. When they are silenced, civilizations stumble. History proves this again and again. And here's something even more profound: these women didn't wait for permission to become leaders. Khadijah didn't ask the Quraysh if she was allowed to run a business empire. Aisha didn't ask if she was allowed to teach men. Fatimah al-Fihri didn't ask if she was allowed to build a university. Musa didn't ask if she was allowed to pick up a sword. They saw what needed to be done, and they did it. That's the mark of a trailblazer. And it raises a question for us: how often do we wait for someone to approve our dreams before we chase them? The legacy of these women is not just a set of stories to admire. It is a challenge. It's a call to rise. To recognize that no matter who you are, no matter what limits society tries to place on you, your influence can ripple through time if you choose courage over comfort. These women faced real obstacles: patriarchal structures, hostile societies, danger, ridicule. Yet they broke through, not because they wanted fame, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. And maybe that's the key. They weren't chasing recognition. They were chasing purpose. Khadijah gave her wealth not to be remembered, but to see the message of Islam survive. Aisha taught not to build her own reputation, but to preserve the Prophet's teachings. Fatimah al-Fihri built a university not to stamp her name in stone, but to make sure knowledge would never die. Musa fought not to be called a warrior, but to protect the messenger of Allah. And in that sincerity, Allah wrote their names in eternity, even if the world sometimes forgets to repeat them. So when we talk about pioneers, when we talk about trailblazers, when we talk about leaders, let's not confine those titles to the ones who sat on thrones. Let's remember the women whose sacrifices, intellect, and vision made Islam what it is. And let's remember that their story is not finished. Because every time a Muslim woman today chooses courage, chooses to speak, to learn, to lead, to create, she is continuing that legacy. She is walking the trail they blazed centuries ago. And perhaps that is the most inspiring part of all. The story of these women is not locked in the past. It is a living story, one that stretches into us. When you honor them, you don't just honor history, you honor yourself. Because their blood, their strength, their faith runs in the veins of this Ummah. They remind us that leadership has no gender, courage has no limits, and legacy has no expiration date. They remind us that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with a roar, but with the quiet determination of someone the world isn't even watching. And if we listen closely, their stories whisper the same invitation. It's your turn now. Imagine sitting in a room filled with silence. In front of you is a single candle, its flame flickering in the dark. One spark, one fragile light. If you lean too hard, it could be extinguished. If the wind blows too strong, it could vanish. And yet, from that one tiny flame, you could light 1,000 more candles until the room becomes brighter than the sun. That's the story of Islam. It began with sparks, fragile, trembling, vulnerable. And so often it was the women who protected those sparks, who turned them into fire that still burns in our hearts today. Their legacy is not just history, it is a call to rise, to lead, to carry forward what they once carried, so that the flame never dies. When Khadijah believed in the Prophet at a time when no one else dared, she wasn't just comforting her husband, she was shaping destiny. Imagine her voice, steady and calm, telling him, Allah will never disgrace you. In that moment, when fear and doubt weighed heavy on his heart, she became his anchor. That's what true leadership looks like. Not standing on a stage, but standing firm when someone else is about to fall. Today, in our own lives, how often do we find ourselves surrounded by people who need that same reassurance? A friend drowning in self-doubt, a child afraid to dream, a spouse unsure of the future. Khadijah's legacy teaches us that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to say, I believe in you, because belief can ignite fires that change the world. Then comes Aisha, whose brilliance made knowledge feel alive. She didn't just memorize hadith, she dissected them, explained them, contextualized them. She argued with confidence, debated with scholars, and left a body of knowledge so vast it would feed generations of minds. Imagine her teaching in her home in Medina, a group of men sitting around her, their pens scratching parchment as they wrote down every word she spoke. In those gatherings, she wasn't just transferring information, she was shaping minds, building a legacy of critical thought, of understanding, of depth. And that raises a question for us: what knowledge are we preserving, passing on, planting in others? Are we letting wisdom die with us, or are we pouring it into the hearts of those who will outlive us? Aisha's life teaches us that knowledge isn't meant to be stored. It's meant to be shared, multiplied, expanded, just like that candle lighting countless others. Then we see Fatimah al-Fihri, who dreamed bigger than herself. With her inheritance, she could have lived in luxury, but instead she built a university that outlasted empires. Imagine walking through those halls today, the smell of old manuscripts still clinging to the air, the sound of footsteps echoing on the same stones where scholars once debated astronomy, medicine, philosophy. And then remember, all of it started with the vision of one woman. That's what legacy looks like. Building something you may never see fully bloom. How many of us are willing to build for a future we may not touch? Fatimah's story whispers to us greatness is not in what you consume, but in what you construct for those who come after you. And then there is Musa, standing tall on the battlefield, a shield of flesh and faith. Imagine the dust in her lungs, the blood running down her arm, the clash of steel ringing in her ears. Yet wherever the Prophet turned, she was there, unwavering. She didn't wait for someone to assign her courage. She didn't ask for permission to be brave. She simply chose it. That is a legacy we need today. Because every one of us faces battles, not with swords, but with doubts, temptations, injustices, pressures that push us to compromise. And the question becomes, will we run when it gets hard, or will we stand even when the wounds come, even when it hurts? Nusayba's story teaches us that courage is not comfort, it is commitment, no matter the cost. But here's the deeper truth. These women are not just stories to admire, they are reminders of who we are meant to be. Too often we think of history as a museum, filled with relics behind glass, untouchable, distant. But the legacy of these women is not a relic, it's a torch. It's passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart, and now it rests with us. What will we do with it? Will we carry it forward, or will we let it burn out in our generation? That's the real question. Think of it like a relay race. The baton has been passed down through centuries. Khadijah to Aisha, Aisha to Fatimah al-Fihri, Fatimah to Nusayba, and countless others whose names history has hidden. Each one ran their part with courage, with faith, with sacrifice. And now that baton is in our hands. The crowd is watching, the track is before us, and the only question is, will we run with the same fire, Or will we stumble, too distracted, too afraid, too comfortable to continue the race? Their legacy is a mirror too. It reflects back to us the excuses we make. We say, I'm too small to make a difference. Yet Khadijah's belief started when Islam was just one man trembling in a cave. We say, I'm too young. Yet Aisha was teaching scholars while still in her youth. We say, I don't have enough resources. Yet Fatimah al-Fihri turned what she had into something eternal. We say, I'm too weak, too ordinary. Yet Nusayba, with her wounds and scars, stood firm when entire armies scattered. Their stories strip away our excuses until all that remains is the question, if they could rise, why can't we? And maybe the most powerful part of their legacy is how ordinary they seemed. None of them wore crowns. None of them commanded armies of millions. None of them had technology, platforms, or spotlights. They were women in a world that often tried to silence them. And yet, through sincerity, courage, and vision, they left footprints so deep that we still walk in them today. That means you don't need extraordinary circumstances to leave an extraordinary legacy. You just need extraordinary faith. So when we talk about their legacy, don't imagine it as something locked in ancient scrolls or old mosques. Imagine it as something breathing inside you right now. Every time you choose to stand up for truth, you are echoing Nusayba. Every time you dedicate yourself to learning and teaching, you are walking in the footsteps of Aisha. Every time you invest in something bigger than yourself, you are living like Fatimah al-Fihri. Every time you believe in someone when no one else does, you are carrying the spirit of Khadijah. Their legacy is not separate from us. It is alive in us if we choose to embrace it. And maybe that's the secret no one tells you. You are not just reading history. You are part of it. The question is not whether you will leave a legacy. The question is what kind of legacy it will be. Will it be one of fear, silence, and hesitation? Or will it be one of faith, courage, and vision, like the women who came before us? The torch is in your hands now, and the world is waiting to see how brightly you will let it burn. So here we are, standing at the edge of history, looking back at giants whose names should echo through every corner of our lives. Khadijah, Aisha, Fatimah al-Fihri, Nusayba. Women who refused to wait, who refused to stay silent, who refused to let fear write their story. They lit flames in their time, and those flames have reached us. But now the question is burning in front of you. What will you do with the fire? Will you let it fade? Will you bury it beneath excuses, distractions, and doubts? Or will you carry it, protect it, and let it blaze so bright that the next generation cannot help but see? This is not just their story. This is your story. This is our story. A story of courage, a story of faith, a story of rising again and again, no matter the cost. Do not wait. Do not hesitate. Do not underestimate the power of your voice, your faith, your choices. Because every act of courage, every pursuit of knowledge, every moment you lift someone up, you are writing the next chapter of their legacy. Remember this: the world does not change when you whisper, someday. The world changes when you declare, today. Today is the moment to rise. Today is the moment to lead. Today is the moment to carry their torch forward. And if you ever doubt yourself, if you ever wonder whether you can truly make a difference, just remember the truth that history has already proven they already did. You already can. And together we already will.